of teaching Daniel is the getting lost in the weeds. Because it is such a complicated book as we run through and look at everything that sometimes you get into Daniel 7 and Daniel 9, you could spend a year there. And you think I'm exaggerating, but you could spend a year there. And the entire book works that way. It is a masterpiece in the way in which it works. Now, I know a lot of us in here, a lot of the fellas have told me they've taught through the book before, and we have a lot of people who are very good Bible experts. And if you're going through here, my favorite commentary I've run across so far is Rex Turner. So that's going to kind of speak a language if you have worked through some of the commentaries and such. But there's a lot of good stuff throughout it. Now, I passed out some sheets for us to use. That backside, the introduction is what it says. I'm saying the backside because we're going to spend most of our time. That gives you some of the dates of the world history, what the world is looking at like at this point, and the things that are going on, and a little bit of what's called a chiastic structure, which a chi is the Greek letter X for us. And theoretically, the Persians are the ones who perfected this, and that's another rabbit hole you can go down through forever. Sermon on the Mount is in a chiastic structure. The book of Ephesians is in a chiastic structure. You've got 3 of them in the book of Revelation if you squint and look hard enough, and you'll find it throughout the Bible. But generally, it's a way of organizing material, and we'll get here in a little bit to the book of Daniel and how it's put together, and it'll help us to see why that chiastic or chiastic structure works in that way. But, all right, here's the world. As far as what Daniel sees. He sees the northern kingdom of Syria falling about 609. He sees Babylon and its power coming from the north. He sees Egypt and its power coming from the south. He sees the good King Josiah working politics back and forth. And he sees where Josiah goes out as an ally of Babylon, and he's killed by the Egyptians. And then he sees that the Babylonians, after they destroy the Egyptians, they begin ravaging Judah, the southern kingdom, and they began slowly picking apart the southern kingdom of Judah. And so that's the background of what we see going through. Babylon will fall at 586. As a matter of fact, 605 is when it first fell, so you're looking at about a 20-year period. 605, Nebuchadnezzar will come into Babylon, and he takes the king captive and the king's family captive. The people who are training to be the government administrators, the people who are sons of the nobility. Daniel likely was not a son of the king. He wasn't a prince. But he grew up in the nobility. And so he had a good life, a wonderful life. It got a little rough when you start reading 2 Kings 24:1 and seeing some of the things which happened to Daniel when he got taken into exile. But he had lived a good life. And then the king comes and takes him. Of course, in 586 they come, second wave, they destroy the city of Jerusalem. They also come, there's 3, maybe 4 different waves, which you'll see as you run through there and look at those notes and see. What's interesting about Daniel is it's 2 books. And there you go with that chiastic structure. Chapters 1 through 7, are what we know if you've gone to children's Bible class. And they're the stories that we're used to and that we like, right? You got Daniel who says, I'm not going to eat that food. You've got the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who say, we will not bow down. You've got Daniel in the lion's den, if you go to chapter 6. And these are all great VBS stories. These are great sermons and things such as that. And the first 6 chapters are narrative, and they come across in Aramaic. In other words, it's written in a language where everybody can read it. This is a language that the Egyptians could understand, the Babylonians could understand, everybody. And so you see the first first 7 chapters written in Aramaic and narrative. And that's the part we love. Daniel put this together to show a lesson. And you're going to see it. Every chapter is hammering something home. And it's a message for the whole world. And that message is God is in charge. God rules over all things. You're going to see in chapter 1, you don't have to conform to the world. You stay faithful to your God. God's going to take care of you. You're going to see in chapter 2, do not bow down to that throne. Or you see in chapter 2, the vision, of the statue. You see in chapter 3, you do not bow down to a foreign god, to an idol. God will take care of you. And over and over and over. The point of every chapter is God will take care of his people. God is truly in charge. The Babylonians may run an empire, but that's because God lets them run an empire. And as soon as God's done with them, he'll get rid of them. Then, chapter 7 through chapter 12, total transition to the book. Now, instead of Aramaic, where everybody can read it, it's written in the Hebrew language, where only the Jewish people can read it. Now, instead of it going to everybody and being a message to all people, it's a message that only God's people can understand, and it's written in what we call apocrypha or apocalyptic literature. That means to be revealed, or that means to be hidden. Suddenly numbers begin meaning great things. Suddenly certain names begin meaning great things. There's a lot of symbolism. And so if Nebuchadnezzar were to read the book of Daniel, he understands the first 6 chapters. Chapter 7 through 12, he's saying, this does not make sense at all. And even today, people read it and they're like, what in the world does he say? Apocalyptic literature, symbolic literature, it's a word I like using because I can spell symbolic, is written to oppressed people. To people who need a message that reminds them that God is in charge. And so Daniel and his friends have been taken into captivity. They're now slaves. They now have no freedom. But God is sending them a message saying, God is in charge. And you're part of God's plan. And God's going to work things the way it needs to go. Now you see this apocalyptic literature in the book of Daniel. You'll see a little bit of it in the book of Ezekiel. And in the New Testament, we're most familiar with it in the book of Revelation. And each time it's written in symbolism to teach us a special message that God is in charge. So that's a little bit of the background. We could spend a lot more time with the background, but I want to run into Scripture today. And I want us to read in the Bible and see what it is that God wants to tell us today. So Daniel chapter 1, let's begin to look at verse 1 and 2. Okay? In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. So what you see here is the nation has fallen. Nebuchadnezzar has taken over Jerusalem. The city has fallen. This is the 3rd wave. And so all these people are being pulled out. And the temple is destroyed. All these things are no more. And this is because God's people have been unfaithful. This is the answer given right here. Now, look here in verse 3, okay? Then the king instructed Ephinez, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles. Young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed to them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that by the end they might serve before the king. Now, from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Later we'll know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, to Azariah, Abednego. All right, so here you see the exile, and they're coming in waves. This part are the king's sons, the royal nobility. And they're brought into Babylon. Later, the next wave is going to be Ezekiel's crew. That's a refugee camp which lives outside the city who will return. And then later we'll see Jeremiah's crew. And that's just the refuse or the people who nobody really cared about. But they figured, hey, we might as well take something. Might as well get them as well. Like the other day, I was in Hobby Lobby, and they're already sold out of all their Christmas stuff. And it's like, well, we're a month before Christmas. Well, what are we going to do? You just find what's left and pretend that's your decoration, right? That's the way Israel was at that time. So, Daniel's group is taken. And as they're taken, they're going to be trained. Now, let's talk about some of these empires and their ideas. The first empire was Assyria. Assyria was very racist. They were in charge. They did not care about anybody. Their idea was the more people we kill, the more afraid they'll be. And so the Assyrians just wiped out the northern kingdom. Very, very few people survived it. The Babylonians had this idea of if we go into and take a nation, what we'll do is we take their brightest and best and we turn them into Babylonians. Make them dress like us, make them believe like us, make them act like us, and the rest of them we'll take out of their city and we will keep as hostage. And if they're not in their hometown, then they're not going to be patriotic. You know, they're not going to fight you because they're refugees. Now later the Persians will take over. The Persians were live and let live. You just pay your taxes. Later would be the Greeks. The Greeks' idea was it's best to be Greek. Everybody needs to be Greek. So everybody, let's be Greek. The U.S. pretty similar to that today as far as our empire building. And then later you'll see the Romans who established their empire and established structure everywhere. So here the Babylonians, they take Daniel and his group, and what I want us to talk about in our class, they decide these men are now going to be Babylonians. And you see this struggle happening for the next 6 chapters. God's people are in an ungodly world. What does that look like? What does that look like to be a godly person in an ungodly world? Now, let's look behind the scenes, and it's hard to do, but let's pretend we're looking behind the scenes and think of Daniel's life. What he's seen. As a young man, and he's obviously a young man because he's going to serve Nebuchadnezzar all the way to King Cyrus. So we're going to go through his ministry lasts 67 years. That's a long time. So obviously he was a young man. But as a young man in Jerusalem, being a child of the king in nobility, you have certain expectations of life, right? Certain dreams, certain ways in which you want to live, certain ideas which are there. All that's gone. Parents most likely have been murdered. Many of his friends most likely are dead. He is hauled all the way, hundreds of miles away to Babylon. And now everybody looks different. Everybody talks different. Everybody believes different. And now everybody is saying, Daniel, who you are does not matter. You are now going to have to live just like us. Imagine what's going through Daniel's mind. If that happened in your life, would you still be a Christian? If you grew up in the shadow of the temple, and then your parents were killed, all these prayers and sacrifices obviously didn't seem to work. If your friends were killed, if you were hauled away and made to worship other gods, would you be faithful enough to stay with God? Now, let's apply that a little bit more to hopefully what we see a little bit more. Hopefully this is not going to happen to our country in our lifetime. But there's a question. What do you do when you're brought into Babylon? What do you do when you're brought into Babylon? A lot of our kids grow up in church. You know, they grow up in our Bible classes. They're a part of our youth group, you know, and they're active and everything else. It's time to go to college. You move out of home. What do you do that first Sunday when you've been out Saturday night till about 3 in the morning and it's time to get up and go to church and you don't know the preacher, you don't know anybody at this new church, and they're not going to know whether you're there or not, and it almost feels like they don't care whether you're there or not. There's a lot of our kids that we send off to college that aren't faithful while they're at college. Now, we don't advertise that very much. And we do have some kids who are very faithful, both at Christian college and at secular college. But is their faith being built strong enough here before they're sent out? That's a question to ask. And I imagine every one of us, a lot of us are third or fourth generation Benton folks, right? You know, you sit on a pew, chairs, and you've got great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, children, and it sometimes goes more generations than that. It's just a family thing. But in a sense, every one of us, at some time in our life, has been taken to Babylon. Maybe it's work, and people don't act the way that they should at work, and maybe they pressure you and try to force you not to act the way you should, because this is the world, it's not church. Maybe it's school, where they're teaching things that you don't agree with, that don't agree with the Bible. Maybe it's a family situation. Maybe all of us might have a different definition of what your Babylon looks like. And so these first 6 chapters, Daniel is hammering home a message, not just to the kings who are going to be reading this, but also to his fellow Jews. You may be in Babylon, but God still owns you. You may be in Babylon, but God still has you. Let's look a little bit deeper. They learned the Chaldean language and culture. They were taught the Chaldean religion. Now, just a little bit of time. I don't want to get much into the Hebrew and such, but let's look at these words. Daniel grew up with the word named Daniel, which means God will judge. God is the one who judges me. In other words, it's God that I need to please. That's what the word Daniel means. And he held to that name. They worked to change his name to Belshazzar, which means the god Bel, that's the Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian god, Bel protects his life. He said, Daniel, it's not God taking care of you. That temple's destroyed. That old law's destroyed. Now you need to depend on Bel. It's going to be Bel who protects you. Daniel stayed faithful. And for the rest of his life, he oftentimes would say, God is the judge. And every time he says that, it doesn't come across in our language, our English translation. He is going back to his name. God is the judge. Now these other guys, Hannah, which means Yahweh or God has been gracious to me. His name is Shadrach, which means I follow the commands of Aku, who's the moon god. Zariah, his name means Yahweh is helping me. God is always by my side. His name is going to be Abednego, which means I'm the servant of the god Nabu. And so you begin looking across and you see Babylon trying to hammer out the old ways. They're bringing these kids in and they are working to change who they are. Now, I've mentioned before, one of my heroes in church are the kindergarten teachers. Because the first day of kindergarten, you've got those kindergarten kids, they're crying because they've left their mama, and this just chaos, absolute chaos. They're running everywhere, they don't know how to behave, they don't know what to do. And a kindergarten teacher is better than any drill sergeant, because in 2 weeks, those kids are lined up, they know when to go to the restroom, they know where to go and get their food, they're lined up, they know exactly how every day works. Those kindergarten teachers have just this talent and this ability to shape the kids in how they act and how they live. Now, the greatest lie that I think has been taught since the 1950s or 1960s is a lie that values are not included in education. You see, in many ways, the educational system, we say, okay, we're just going to teach arithmetic. 2 + 2 = 4. We're just going to teach history. This country was founded in 1776. We're just going to teach, science. H2O. You put that together and it makes water. And we've come up with this idea or this philosophy that values the philosophy of how you should live and how you should treat one another and what you should believe should not be included in education. Guess what? Values are always included in education. And it's almost impossible not to teach values in education. That's why in a lot of secular teaching, God is pushed out, but there's other things which are brought in its place. Now, I don't mean to down public education. I grew up with public education. It served me well. And all of my kids came through public education, and it served them well. They're able to get jobs, able to live and do well. And so that part I'm happy about. But you got to be careful, because there's always value transaction. There's always a learning of philosophy and how you view the world in every instance of education. Now, it's much more blatant when we're here in Daniel chapter 1. And the reason it's blatant is Israel has been conquered. We need to erase Israel. We need to hit the restart button. And this is a re-education camp. Daniel, don't say God is your judge. Now the God Baal's your judge. Don't eat and follow those old paths. Now follow your own paths. Now follow the way in which we teach you. Don't dress like a Hebrew. Now you dress like a Babylonian. And so they're trying to push these Jewish boys into this box, trying to replicate them as if they're Babylonian and they don't believe in God. And the vast majority of them are shaped. They've experienced trauma. They don't really have a support system. They don't see God anymore because of what's happened in their life. And so now they're being shaped. But there's a few people who are going to stand up. A few people who are going to make the decision that they will stand up for the Lord. And so let's keep reading here. Look there in verse 8. Now, I love the way verse 8 starts, because this is the key to the book. And I don't mean to hammer on the chiastic structure, but here we go. This is the point at which the book spins. And so if you're titling chapter 1, if you ever teach it in a Bible class, the title would be I Am Resolved, because the older translations of verse 8 says Daniel resolved. My newer translation, New King James, says Daniel purposed in his heart. Here you see what's happened to Daniel, and now you're going to see what Daniel does in response. Okay? So that's verse 8. But Daniel resolved, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies or with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. And God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I'm afraid of God. I'm afraid of the king. I fear the Lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. Why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. All right, verse 8. Daniel purposes in his heart. He resolved. He remembered his name. He remembered who he was. His name means God is my judge. It's God that I've got to make happy, not these other people. He made that story and decided that he would be faithful. Now, preachers have an illustration that they use. And this illustration comes from over in California. There's redwood trees over there that are huge. Sequoia trees. Has anybody ever been to see those trees? They're big enough where you could drive through them. Works better if there's a hole already cut. They're huge. Many years ago, one of these trees fell down. And people realized that tree had been around for 600 years. It had survived earthquakes. It had survived the logging efforts of many people. It had survived all sorts of stuff that had happened over all this time. And so they got together to begin to study what would make a 400-foot tree fall down. And when they began to look at the wood there at the root, they found these very, very small beetles. And the beetles had eaten in the wood, made the wood rot to the point where the tree could no longer support itself, and it fell down. Now, preachers love that story because it illustrates how many of us fall away, or how many of us are in danger of falling away. You look at this huge tree, you look at this small beetle. One of those looks awfully insignificant, doesn't it? When you and I look at our faith, we see an opportunity to compromise, but it's not a big deal. It's just a small thing. But when you make that small compromise, the next small compromise comes, and the next small compromise comes, and eventually that wood is rotten and you fall. Daniel here resolved. He purposed in his heart that he was going to stand for God, that he's going to recognize that God was his judge, and he's going to figure out how to get through this situation. Now, the next thing I like, as we read through this chapter, is my 1 Peter 3:15 point. Okay? Always be ready to give an answer for that which you stand for, which you believe in, but do it in a spirit of meekness and gentleness, of humility and caution. There's some times where we make a resolution. I got a bug crawling up here. No compromise. All right. Bug with wings. It flew off. All right. I keep doing this and forgetting where I'm at. All right. We make the decision if we're going to resolve, but he decides how he's going to resolve. A lot of times when something happens to us, we decide, I'm going to fight. And we turn into Peter and we cut off the ear of Malchus and mess up the whole situation. That's not what God's calling us to do. Daniel doesn't stand up and say, you Babylonians can kill me or whatever. I'm not touching this food. He doesn't stand up and say, my God's bigger than your God. I don't care what you say. What's Daniel do? By himself, he politely approaches the guy who's in charge. And he says, listen, I can't eat this. Would it be okay? It's not going to hurt you because you don't have to cook a whole new source of food for me. I'm just not going to eat what you give me, and I'm going to eat the vegetables and the water. And that's all I want. That's all we're going to do. And the guy comes back and he says, I can't do that. If you look skinny, if you look sick and frail, I'm going to lose my head. And Daniel comes back and says, give me 10 days. Let's just do a very quick study. And let's see if we can do this. I want to keep my faith. Let's do this. And I promise you, I will not cause you any problems. And so the man allows him to do that. Now, what was the deal here? I've run across some preachers and, YouTube channel things and things on TV. And there's even been books written about the Daniel diet. If you just drink your vegetables and drink a lot of water, you'll be so much more healthy. That's not what's really being said here. The Babylonians were offering unclean food, pork, catfish, or whatever else it might be. They were offering food that made you a Babylonian and forgot your Jewish faith. And place food in front of these slaves and they'll either starve or they will give up their faith, is what's happening. And Daniel says, I don't want to do either. Just give me something else, something very, very simple, and God's going to see me through it. You see that mindset which is there. So often, I think we've lost people's souls because we preach out of a spirit of anger. We preach out of a spirit of bitterness. We just want to fight and win every argument. But in doing so, we lose a soul. Daniel purposed in his heart of how he was going to live, but then he approached it in a way in which allowed the man in charge of him to live and do well, but also allowed him to remain faithful. That's how we do it. That's how we live this life of exile. All right, Dan.
They were given wine, but even today and also in that time, when you make wine and you put it in a bottle, it stops making alcohol at about 3%, something like that. usually if you have it for supper or whatever, and don't drink the whole bottle, you won't get drunk. But what people do that want the alcoholic zing is they take the fermenting and they break it off the top of the distilling and they ferment it again. Then it becomes 6%. Then they break it off and it becomes 9%. Till they turn it into a liquor, not a natural wine. Therefore, to my understanding, the king wanted the spiked wine, not just the regular that Jewish people ate in their dinner to be healthy and so forth. So I think that needs to be understood that they were probably serving hard liquor to these youngsters, and that's not what Jewish people did.
Yeah, he's absolutely trying to destroy their culture, their nuances of how they would be Jewish.
Yeah.
So that's a very dangerous thing to do. And he really pushed it away. Okay, so the steward takes it away. He says, okay, now let's look at verse 17. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. Daniel had an understanding of visions and dreams. At the end of days, when the king had said they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king interviewed them, and among them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the astrologers who were in the realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. Now that's 67 years later that he'll continue. And so God here blesses these people with knowledge and ability. Now, when Daniel and the 3 friends come in, they're not learning algebra, are they? And they're not learning, they do have to learn the language. This was a class studying astrology, of how to interpret dreams, of how to predict eclipses, comets, all these different things, which the Babylonians and most pagan cultures saw as so very, very significant and strange. I always we're coming up on the Christmas season, I always like how God communicates to the entire world about his son coming. He communicates to these men in the East through astrology. Now, you and I know that when stars align, when things align, whether your Pluto is in retrograde or whatever, I don't know astrology very well at all, but you can tell. We all know that does not have an effect over God. God is the one who's in charge. But God manipulates things to show even these people who are not Jewish that something significant has happened over Bethlehem, that Jesus is born. And so they come, even though they're not Jewish, even though they do not understand God's ways the way that we would, or the Jewish people would, God communicated with all people in that way. So these people are studying these things according to the Babylonian view, and God gives Daniel and these 3 friends an understanding to where they're going to be able to interpret dreams better than anyone else. They're going to be able to interpret these things better than anybody else who's out there. Now let's take a step back as we get ready to close. What you see here is providence. God allowed his people to be destroyed. He allowed Jerusalem to fall. But he, even though Nebuchadnezzar may not realize it, he has just put these people into the hip pocket of Nebuchadnezzar. And for the rest of the book, whenever something happens, there's Daniel right at the ear of Nebuchadnezzar to say, this is what you should do. And this is why this is happening in this way. This is how this is going on. The generation after this, Mordecai is going to say to Esther, perhaps you're put at this place in this time for this reason. Daniel experienced a lot of bad things, but these bad things happened to put Daniel where God needed him to be. There's sometimes bad things may happen in your life, but they're happening because God is getting ready to place you where you need to be, to do what he needs you to do. So when you think of Daniel chapter 1, think of that word resolve or purpose. I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delights, things that are higher, things that are nobler. These have allured my sight. Decide to follow God. All right?